Let me ask you a question. Why did all of our ancestors worship planets? Straight up, why did all of our ancient ancestors have this strange proclivity towards worshiping planets? When was the last time you ever thought about this? I'm going to guess that the vast majority of you probably never gave it a second thought. Why didn't you ever give that a second thought? Why would you not question why our ancestors were obsessed with planets? I mean, obsessed with cosmology in general, no doubt. And absolutely, that's a whole thing. But planets play a huge role, for some weird reason, in all of their mythos, legends, history, whatever you want to call it. They're there and they're everywhere. Why? Why do we find these planets everywhere? This is a legitimate question that researchers in the mainstream have completely forgot about. They don't ask this question anymore because this question is ridiculous if you are coming from a mainstream perspective. And the reason why it's ridiculous is because it doesn't make any sense in the context that mainstream has created to fit all of these ancient histories into, right? So let's just take Osiris, Egyptian Osiris god, right? Just for fun. Egyptian Osiris god is generally related to Saturn. Okay, why? Why is that the case? What's going on here? The Egyptians have this story, the Osiris story with Isis and blah, blah, blah. They have this whole mythos built up. And for whatever reason, these characters are related to planets. Alright, before we go any further, let me lay out what I want to talk about here. So in this show, I want to go over another basic question regarding ancient history. And that question is, why are gods related to planets? That's it. And I'm already going off on mainstream. Let me pull back for a second. So first of all, this discussion will be just that. I just want to ask a question and employ basic critical thinking skills and the scientific method. That's all we're going to do in this show. We're just going to break down a very basic question, and we're going to see what we can get out of it if we approach it objectively. So let's start by getting rid of all of our preconceived notions. Let's get rid of all of the stuff that we think we already know. And this goes for everybody, right? So if you're more on the mainstream side of things and you know people who have degrees, who believe in whatever answer they have for this question, and you think that they are the god and the immortal person who has all the knowledge because they've been given the degree, blah, let's put that aside. Let's just step that aside. Regardless of where you fall on the answer to this question, what we can do here is we can do a thought experiment that will build your critical thinking skills up regardless of where you fall on that spectrum. All right, so this is important. So if you aren't doing critical thinking exercises in general, ask yourself that question. When was the last time you did a real critical thinking exercise, right? When was the last time that you took a subject that you felt really comfortable with and you threw away all of that knowledge and looked at it from a completely different perspective while employing the scientific method and critical thinking skills? When was the last time you did that to any subject, right? You'll find that a lot of people, even yourself, if you want to admit it, you probably don't do it that often. And that's just basic human psychology. Once we get stuck on an idea and we start crusading for it and blah, 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 and you say it enough to yourself long enough and the lie becomes truth. Not to say that what you believe in is a lie. I'm just saying that whatever you believe in can become true if you keep telling yourself it is true. So that's basically what happens to everybody within the research community, regardless if you're on the alt side or the mainstream side. That happens all the time. So let's just have fun here. Let's push aside all of our preconceived notions. Don't worry about it. Whatever position you hold, regardless, whether you're the alt side or the mainstream side, you alt side people are just as guilty as the mainstream side as well. The alt research side, they have all their crazy stuff that they hold on to, and they never question it. They don't want to question it. Just like anyway. Okay, you get my point. All right, back to the topic at hand. Why did our ancient ancestors worship planets? I mean, what was the point of that? So to set the stage for this, let's just throw down a couple of good foundational building stuff here, whatever. All right, so we know for a fact that the vast majority, if not all cultures, back in the day, ancient, I'm talking thousands of years ago, they all worship planets, right? Every time you go to read an ancient culture's history, for whatever reason, we constantly find Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, etc., all over the place in these guys' stories. And this is something that we just take for granted. We're just so used to hearing about planets being related to gods that we don't even second guess it anymore. It's just there, and we just assume that somebody's got it all figured out because they've got, the general stories translated or something, and, oh, these guys must be really smart. They've got it all figured out, so there's no reason for me to think about it, so everybody moves on with life. But this is really an important question, because it is very strange that all of our ancient ancestors, to one degree or another, worshipped planets. Now, to set the stage for how we're going to approach this question, let me ask you one other question, right? So yes, I'm not answering a question with a question, but let's set the stage for ourselves personally. Let's build a little bit of experience. If I come to you and I say, hey, look, I need you to create a god. Maybe 2 gods, whatever, 1, 2, 10, whatever you want to do. But what I need you to do is I need you to come up with gods to worship. And I need you to base these gods off of cosmological situations. Essentially, what I need is something physical that I can see to worship. So you look at me and you're like, well, are you on drugs? And I say, no. Why, do you have any? And then you say, yeah, buddy, let's go around the back corner. And I'm like, oh, hell yeah. Okay, no, we don't do that. Drugs are bad. But I need you to come up with something to worship. So you're sitting there. All right, I'm waiting. You're sitting there looking around. It's daytime. All right, you're looking around. You look up at the sky because I need it to be cosmological. And you're like, well, the sun. I mean, the sun, there's it gives us heat. It's basically associated with life. That seems to make sense as a god. Let's worship the sun. All right, and I agree. I look at you and I'm like, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It's the sun. I feel the heat too. We can worship that. I'm down with that. What else? What other gods can you give me? I need more than one god, right? I mean, all of our ancient ancestors certainly had more than one god. So I want more than one god as well. So I look to you and I say, give me more gods. And you can look up and around. You'd be like, well, there's some clouds. I guess you could do a god after a cloud, but clouds, we'll put a pin in that, but I don't know if that's really godlike. So we hang around, we stare at the wall for a while, or selling drugs, whatever we're doing at the time, it doesn't matter. But the time passes, and as time passes, night comes. And so I say to you again, hey, I still want a god, man. I still need more gods. So you look up at the sky and you're like, all right, well, I mean, there's the moon. I mean, the moon's pretty bright and it kind of moves across the sky. It's got phases. We can do something with the moon. And yeah, all right, yeah, I agree. Let's do something with the moon. I look at the moon, I say, yeah, that is definitely something I could definitely worship. It's a ball in the sky. It's got phases. It does stuff. It's pretty epic. All right, the moon. So we've got 2 gods. The sun and the moon. But I say, look, I kind of want more gods though, man. I want more stuff going on up in the cosmological sky. And you kind of stare at it for a while and you could say, well, I mean, I guess the stars, but the stars, I don't know, man. The stars don't really do anything. They're there every night, but they're kind of like clouds. They're just kind of there. They don't seem to really ever matter, right? I mean, they don't cause us any grief. The stars don't do anything. I mean, they literally don't do anything. So it's kind of hard to want to worship a star. I mean, we can use them for navigation, yes, but that's not really godlike. That's not a god thing. I don't want to. So, we're sitting there staring and you're like, well, I don't know, man. What else? I look around more and I look up and I'm like, well, we know there's planets up there. And you say, yeah, I know that. And we both look up and I say, hey, can you show me where Saturn is? Can you point to Saturn? And you look up and nope, you shrug. They all look the same. They're all dots. If Saturn is up there, if it's up there at that moment, I don't know if it's on the other side of the Earth's orbit. But even if we could see it, how would I even identify it? I mean, it literally looks like any other star. And that's a pretty big planet, right? Saturn's not small. I'm like, all right, fine. What about Mars or Venus or something like that? We look around and kind of run into the exact same problem. I don't know where these planets are. First of all, I mean, we know they exist, and we're talking about our period, right? We're not in the past. We know they're there, but I mean, the reality is the vast majority of people, me included, I cannot just look up at the sky. We don't look up at the sky, and we're not like, oh, hey, there's Venus, there's Mars, there's Jupiter, there's Saturn, blah, 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 blah. I got it all mapped out. Very few people have that capability, right? If we look up at the sky and we're trying to figure out something to worship, the reality is we find ourselves in a position where we only have two cosmological bodies that make any sense: the sun and the moon. So this brings us to the question, why did our ancestors worship all of these other planets? If we look at the little hypothetical exercise that I just walked us through really fast, or like 10 minutes, whatever, the hypothetical exercise that I just went through was there for a reason. It was there to get you thinking about, if you had to create gods, who would you worship? Now, the only obvious two bodies to worship are the sun and the moon. Now, that seems pretty clear. And our ancestors definitely have solar and lunar gods. Interestingly enough, those gods only appear at a very certain time in history. So what this exercise ultimately elucidates for us is that if we're just humans hanging out and we decide we are going to create gods based on a cosmological situation, our options are limited. We have two options, maybe three if you want to mess around with stars. But like I said in the exercise, stars really aren't all that impressive, right? Now, right now you can probably start fighting back or asking the question, but those people back in the day, they would have been able to see maybe the planets better because there wouldn't have been as much light. And alright, interesting point, and we will cover that in just a little bit. But for the basic foundational situation that we find ourselves in right now, we have to admit 100% that there are only two cosmological bodies that would qualify for a planetary god, or for a cosmological god, right? So if just going through a basic thought experiment like we just went through, what we can say is, we can say as humans, from the human experience, because we're humans, unless you're a reptoid, in which case you already know how this discussion goes. But if you're a human, then what we've done is we've laid the groundwork from a psychological perspective of, there's no reason to create gods out of planets. There is no reason to create a god out of Mars. There's no reason to make Venus the god of love, right? What are you talking about, right? So let's keep moving. So what we've established right now is that if our ancestors make anything else a god other than the moon and the sun, they must have been doing something else. Something else must have been going on either in their society or in the sky itself that would inspire our ancestors to create gods. Let's start with the society part of it. Let's start with the human basic culture situation. All right, so we know that ancient people had gods of war, pestilence, everything. There's a god for everything, right? Rebirth, blah, 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 underworld stuff. There's all these gods for all this stuff going on. And it's weird that we have all these planets related to all of these gods of events. Like, that's what goes on. So why would these people, if it was we're looking at the society part right now. Okay, we're on the ground floor. We're in our village or whatever, our huts, village, stone temple, whatever. We're just chilling. But why are we making up gods of war, pestilence, etc.? Now, the mainstream viewpoint, and the viewpoint that we can start out with regardless, would be that people were dumb back then and they just needed something to blame the unknown on, right? So if there was some sort of a disease infection that was going around killing everybody or turning them into clowns or whatever, they needed a way to explain that because they didn't have the technology to really break it down and be like, oh, hey, look, there's a virus floating around, or there's a bacterium killing everybody, right? They didn't see that, so they blame a god. There's some god somewhere, he's pestilence, and he just kills everybody, right? I don't know, because we didn't dance right, or we didn't sacrifice enough chickens, whatever. Like, our ancestors were apparently dumb, and they had to come up with these weird boogeymen to blame stuff on. Now, that's kind of the mainstream perspective on how they look at all of our ancestors. But how realistic is that? Remember, these people back then, just a few thousand years ago, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, whatever, 10,000, however far kind of you want to go back, thousands of years ago, those people were just like you and me. They were no different biologically. They might have actually been more superior back then. I don't know. But at the very least, science is willing to say that, hey, the people back then were just like you and me. Now, is it possible that every single person back in the day was dumb, even though they had the capabilities, just like you and me, to comprehend some stuff? I'm not saying we're super smart, we're not. But we definitely have the ability to look around and question things. Do we really believe that every single society back in the day would have created these weird boogeymen to explain all the stuff going on within their society and cultures? There's no reason to believe that. In fact, that's dumb. If you're a human like us nowadays, you're a thinker. Now, not every single person is going to be thinking at this depth. I get that. But to say that nobody is doing that? No, that's not happening. There's nothing like that going on. There would have been guaranteed thinkers in these societies that would have been trying to figure out more scientific approaches to explain why stuff was going on. No rain, disease, whatever. They weren't going to default to gods. And certainly not every single culture on the planet was going to default to gods. That's another oddity. In fact, that's a bullet point we'll get to in just a bit. So, you can now say, well, but they were dumb. They only, they couldn't figure stuff out. They had to, they thought there was a god of lightning. God struck you down if you said something bad or whatever, or masturbated wrong. Why does that even exist? What is this? Why do we think that our ancestors were dumb? We have no reason to believe that. Why do we have no reason to believe that our ancestors were stupid? Just look at the stuff that they built. It takes all of 2 seconds to look at something like the pyramids and be like, oh yeah, these people knew what they were doing. If you have a structure where you're squaring the circle, in your building, and you're building the golden ratio into stuff, and you're tracking the speed of light, etc., and you obviously have a working knowledge of longitude and latitude. If you've got all of these objective facts working for a civilization back in the day, that is 100% proof that they were not dumb. So these people knew what they were doing. This means that we can legitimately make the claim that the people back then were intelligent enough to understand that there was other stuff going on in the world, and there was really no reason to blame an invisible sky daddy, right? All right, so we're gonna roll with that, and that we're gonna make that statement and go with it. We have more than enough evidence to substantiate that claim. So you can argue with me, but that's a tough argument. The people back then were not dumb. All right, so we've established that. So that means if we're working with people who have a good intellectual grasp on their surroundings, we ask the question again, why are they believing that the planet Venus is the god of pestilence or love or whatever, depending on what area you're talking about? Why are people associating the gods like this? Where are these stories coming from? Because if you look around at their societies, if you start looking around, I mean, there's no Venus god stomping around killing people. The god of war is not stomping around, ancient Greece and stuff, slapping people around and punching people in the gut. That's not happening. But what is happening? What is going on? So let's look at the stories themselves, because we can basically prove that the gods are not walking around amongst the people doing that stuff, right? And there's no reason to believe that they are anyways, because all of the stories that we're talking about take place in the sky anyway. Now, this is key. This is important. When these people are discussing their gods, where do they live, right? They live in the sky, or on a mountain, which is also high in the sky. All of the stories take place up in the cosmological sky above. They're not happening, people aren't walking next to Thor and, shaking his hand and stuff and, rubbing his feet. That's not happening. Thor is up there in the sky throwing thunderbolts, right? Pallas Athene is up in the sky slapping Mars around, or Ares, whatever you want to call him at the time, right? These things are happening in the sky. And what are the humans suffering from? The humans are generally suffering from the gods' action in the sky falling down onto Earth. Now this is important. So we can right now, with that established fact, we can get rid of the people back then making stuff up, making all these stories up relative to society in general and what's going on within their culture. All right, there's no reason to implant or create gods for any of that stuff. But they do create them. And they are all created and live in the sky above. And there's a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on up in the sky, right? That's where we get all these stories from. There's all these insane things going on in the sky. Now that's the stories. So we can now turn our gaze from the ground dwellers for right now, and we can look upwards. Why? Because that's exactly where the stories tell us to look. All right, fine, you say. We'll look up. Scientifically speaking and critically thinking speaking, we have to admit that the stories all take place up in the sky, and that it's very common for whatever happens up in the sky to affect those below. That's what's recorded, right? That's what we see all over the place. I know it took us 20 minutes to get here, but I wanted to deduce the whole thing to show that we have to look to the sky. All right, fine, we're looking at the sky. Now what? Great. Now you're telling me there's planets in the sky. No kidding, really? There's planets in the sky? Duh. I mean, of course there's planets in the sky, but what does this have to do with all their stories? Now, why is this a problem? You can ask this question with a snarky attitude because of what I talked about earlier. If we all look up at the sky right now and I say, point out Mars, you might look around for that red dot up there somewhere, but chances are good you're not going to be able to find it because you don't know where. Most people have no clue where Mars is orbiting right now. Mars is orbiting right now. Nobody knows. Your average person has no clue where that planet is. Same with Saturn, Jupiter, whatever. So that begs the question, why are they, for example, let's take Osiris from Egyptian mythology. Why are the Egyptians calling Saturn this literal dot in the sky, like the creator god, the sun god? Like, what is this? It's a dot in the sky if you can find it. Now, the mainstream people will say, well, back in the day, you could see everything better, so they were able to track the planets better, and yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, that was probably true. You could, I think, I don't know for a fact, but you could look up, and if you really cared, you could probably track it if you wanted to. But how fast do those planets move in the sky? They're not moving like a meteor or something. Those planets may as well not be moving unless you're sitting there staring at it for hours, right? Or making some sort of a notation in the ground to kind of track it, right? Planets are essentially indistinguishable from a star for your average person, even for your smart person, right? Unless you're obsessed with this stuff, the reality is nobody's finding these planets up in the sky without their app, right? Without pulling out their phone. Back in the day, do you really think everybody was really watching these planets? Well, yes, they were watching these planets. They were watching the planets. So why are these people so obsessed with dots? This is the problem. It's our conundrum. We have the situation to where the planets are basically just indistinguishable from stars, but they play a huge role in everything. Why? Even more to the point, you can even ask another side question. Why don't all the stars play just as much of a role as the planets play? You can kind of say, well, I guess they don't move, but technically, unless you're paying attention, neither do the planets. Right? So why, for example, is Mars called the god of war? Right? This is another question that we can ask within this topic. If you look up at the sky right now, if I ask you, hey, who do you think the god of war is up there? Like, we're sitting outside, starry night, we're passed out from being drunk, and we just woke up in the grass and we're looking up, and I say, which god up there is the god of war? I mean, which one inspires you about war and death and all that stuff? You're going to look at me like I'm crazy. Like, it doesn't make any sense. The question is stupid. You're going to be like, I don't know. There's nothing up there. Nothing's going on. Why would there be a god of war up there? What the hell's wrong with you? Right? And you start slapping me and I start choking you out and you're like, ah! But the question stands. Why did our ancient ancestors have, for example, a god of war in Mars? So at this point, mainstream people will bow out. right? The mainstream establishment will be like, you know, it doesn't matter. These people had stories. They were astronomers, even though they were stupid, but they were still highly skilled astronomers, right? You like that? Yeah. That's literally what mainstream people think about our ancestors. But they just, you know, they could track the planets, and they just named the God of War after that, and that's it, and they moved on with life. And then mainstream people, they bow out of the conversation. Now, alternative researchers, depending on where you are over in that whole spectrum side of things, you guys, I mean, we have people that actually believe that these people were real gods. All right, fine. You've got real, you know, sky daddies up there. Okay, you've got that. Then you've got like aliens. I guess, you know, Zeus was an alien and Mars was an alien or something. You know, you can go into all of that. But do we need to do any of that? Could there be another possibility scientifically? Right? We have no reason to believe that these are just stories made up for fun. We don't have to believe that. There is no proof of that, nor do any of the ancient texts come with a warning at the beginning of any of them that say, "Attention reader, this is fiction. Do not take this literally." They don't do that. They don't do that. All right. Now, on the alternative side, or religious side, I guess, as well, there's no reason for us to believe like it's a sky daddy situation, nor is it some sort of weird alien situation, because we don't have any proof for that either. But what do we have on the scientific front of possibilities? What we have with the science is that what if our ancient ancestors were able to see the planets better than we can see them today? Is it possible that the planet configurations of today were not the same 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 plus years ago? Now, this is a scientific possibility. There is nothing about asking that question that is unscientific. So if alarm bells just started going off in a lot of your head, basically you think I'm crazy. What's wrong with this guy? Is he saying that the planetary motions, which we know for a fact have been unchanged for billions of years, were actually different just a few thousand years ago? And we have no choice but to come to that conclusion. Why come to that conclusion? Because all of our ancient ancestors literally describe seeing that exact scene. It gets more interesting. As we start to read a lot of the more in-depth legends and mythologies of these ancient peoples, we find that they are literally describing the planets visually, how they look. Not only that, but they also describe how they get to look how they look. For example, we know now that Mars has one hell of a huge scar across the face of the planet. We know that because we've sent orbiters over there and we can take pretty good pictures, relatively speaking. Now, this Valles Marineris exists. We know that for a scientific fact. What is interesting is that if we go back into ancient people's stories, they talk about how Mars, very specifically Mars, becomes a scarred god. All right. Now the scar obviously could easily be related to Valles Marineris. Now the first problem we run into is how the hell did the people back then know that Mars would have a scar on it? There's no real reason for every single ancient culture to mirror that story, and yet they do. Even more interesting is that all of these ancient cultures, not all but most, whoever survived, they literally have a story about how Mars got the scar. Now, when people were reading about the scarred god of Mars, you know, scarred god of war back in the day before we had all the orbiters and stuff going around and getting these pictures, people just related, oh yeah, you know, the god of war, Mars, scar, makes sense. But now that we started seeing pictures of Mars with a huge planet-sized scar on it, things begin to change. So we begin to find ourselves in a position to where not only are our ancestors worshiping planets, not necessarily worshiping, but they're just talking about them. They are describing what happens to them. And we now have the scientific evidence today to back up what they were already talking about thousands of years ago. Now, this is a real problem for mainstream cosmology, but it's a point in our favor as we go through our deduction. right? So if we're going to say that the ancient ancestors, they must have been able to see the planets up in the sky at some point. Because how else could they describe them? Did they have super telescopes? Were they traveling through space? We have no evidence for any of that. We don't have evidence for people, with giant telescopes checking this stuff out. We don't have any of that, and they don't describe it anyways. So we have no reason to believe that they had the technology to see it. The only way they could know the stuff they know about the planets is if the planets were closer to Earth during certain stages. Now, as we go through all of our ancient cultures' histories, we start to find that that's the case. Even more insane is that these people were tracking these planets. It's funny, when you start to go back and you look at ancient cultures and you start to look at their astronomy doesn't line up with today's astronomy, right? Their calendars don't line up with today's calendars. So when mainstream historians, archaeologists, whatever, started to find this stuff and they were reading it and they were like, well, this doesn't match up with what we see today, they must be stupid. That was the only conclusion they were able to come to. Now, for our purposes here, we can go beyond that. We don't have to come to that conclusion. Why? Because there's no reason to. The only reason that you would ever come to that conclusion is basically you've decided to give up. We're not going to give up. So, is it possible that our ancestors could have seen the planets in different orbits where they were closer to Earth? And of course the answer is yes. The answer is 100% yes. There is nothing unscientific about that possibility. Now, if you want to argue that, that's fine, but really quickly, let's substantiate our new claim. Let's look at the Earth-Moon relationship. These are two planetary bodies that have no problem existing within close proximity of one another, right? Saturn and Jupiter both have large moons. All of those moons orbit, no problem. There is no reason to think that large astronomical bodies could not have been closer in our past. There's no reason to believe that at all. It's entirely possible that that was the case. So now that we have scientific proof that it is entirely possible for planets to exist within a close proximity with one another, the next question is, all right, fine, but prove it. How would we know that these people saw that? Well, it's literally what they say. It's eyewitness testimony, right? That's where all of these stories come from. They're these gods. These gods are not gods. They're planets. My rule nowadays is that when you start to look at an ancient historical history or whatever, every time somebody starts talking about a god, replace the word god with planet. Suddenly that story completely changes and becomes possible. Alright, this video has gone on way longer than I planned it to go. So, I think I've made basically the case that there is a possibility that our ancestors worshipped planets because they saw them in the sky. And I don't mean the little pinprick of light that we see nowadays. It is entirely possible that our ancestors actually saw and describe in their mythologies the planets on different orbits than what we see today. Now, I understand that you can come back swinging with other arguments. You can. And of course, the mainstream, that's all the mainstream does, right? But if in this case, we have been able to come to the conclusion that our ancestors actually saw the planets in different orbits, much closer to Earth, by following logic, deduction, basic critical thinking skills, right? We just employed very basic critical thinking skills. I don't have 10 hours, well, I guess I could do 10 hours, but I'm not going to spend 10 hours going through every little piece of evidence to simply prove a possible reason why our ancestors worshipped planets back in the day. Why did they take their time to even, what's the point? Anyways, using logic, deduction, reasoning, etc., what we just did is we were able to do a thought experiment that took a different approach than what your average person in academia for sure would take. But even the alternative researcher people don't really go this route either. So if we put no preconceived notions in our path, we can come to the conclusion that our ancestors did indeed see planets in the sky in completely different orbits, which means they may have been much closer to Earth. Now, this train of thought has the potential to explain all kinds of problems that we run into when we start to explore ancient history. Mainstream literally has to figure out why so many ancient cultures knew what Saturn looked like. There are tons of ancient cultures that knew, for example, Saturn has rings, right? We know Saturn has rings. They knew it too. And you need a telescope to see that, at least in today's day and age. And then, of course, there's the example of battle-scarred Mars, right? The god of war. All of these ancient cultures during a very specific time period have Mars as a god of war, right? Not only do they all have him as a god of war for some weird reason, but they also know about his giant scar, right? They are also aware of Valles Marineris. It's right there. They know about it. Right? So, and it gets even crazier, actually. They, not only do they know about the scar, the ancient cultures actually know how he got it, or how the planet got it. Now, this is a real problem for anybody in mainstream academia. You have to somehow explain why and how ancient peoples knew anything about Mars. I mean, anything about how it looked like, especially, right? So these are real facts that we need to deal with. So what we've just done here is we've just used our skills to try to deduce a different route based on nothing but evidence, logic, and reasoning. And I think we've done that. And now that I've gone on long enough in this, we're going to end this video. We're going to, you know what? We're going to do more detail about the planets from here, since we can use this as a foundation to then jump into why they recorded what they recorded about the planets, and we'll get into some of the science about how the planets could have been closer to Earth and closer to each other, and how they interacted. Alright, we'll do that next.